Welcome to episode 64 of The Liz McMullen Show. I'm welcoming Shelley Thrasher. Thank you so much for being a guest.
Thank you for asking me, Liz. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, it's my pleasure because I practically tackled you at GCLS. And I'm like, I watch you on my show.
Yeah, that was fun at GCLS. Are you going in the summer?
Yeah, I am. And I'm going to be on a panel or two, and I have a table at the expo hall part of it, so you're welcome to come over and say hi.
Okay, great.
So you're going, are you involved in any of the readings or the panels or anything like that?
Right now, I know that I'm going to be helping teach a master class. Justine Saracen and I plan to teach a master class.
Oh, great. What's the topic?
It's on how to write a kick-ass novel.
Very, very good.
Let's see. She will be here to visit me in a week or so. We're going to the Lesbic Lone Star Festival in Austin.
Oh, that's got to be so much fun. It's so far. I live in New Jersey, so I can never go to those things. But my good friend Adrienne Black, who's also my webmaster, she lives in Texas, so she's going to be there too.
Yeah, that's good.
Justine and you must have like a little history hootenanning together then.
I have been her editor since she began at Bold Strokes, and I think that was in 2005. So I've edited all of her novels, and we're good friends also. So I'm looking forward to her visit quite a bit.
Well, that kind of segues into a question that I have for you. You've been a professional editor for quite some time. When did you start to become interested in writing yourself?
I was really interested in writing before I became an editor, but I was a poet at that time, and of course I was an academic or university teacher. So as I had to write scholarly works, and my doctoral dissertation was published as a book, as a scholarly book, and then I started writing poetry. And as I wrote poetry, I thought, well, I need to make it a little longer. So I just developed from being a poet into becoming a novelist. And after I joined Bold Strokes, then I began to learn how to write novels. And, there are definite techniques that are extremely different from being a poet. So I suppose becoming a real novelist, thinking I could write a novel, started when I became an editor for Bold Strokes.
Well, I've heard nothing but good things about you as an editor, and the buzz around the conference was how well you did as an author. It was a phenomenal book. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed doing that. That was truly a labor of love. So it feels good that people would like it.
Oh, yeah. So in your email, you had said that one of the inspirations for the character Jack was Louise Brooks. Was that for her appearance or something other than that?
It was mainly for her appearance. Probably Jack's character was more people that I know. And I think a lot of authors do this. You just put little bits and pieces together. And I wanted someone from the 20s. I wanted a look from the 20s. So as I researched, I found Louise Brooks, and I thought, that's Jack. That's the way I wanted her to look. So, and I'd really already described her that way, so it just kind of fit together. But I did a little bit of research on her, not very much, and she had a rather troubled childhood and life, and so I thought, well, that fits with Jack too. And I wanted her to be drop dead gorgeous, so I thought Louise Brooks was.
Did you ever watch the remake of Moulin Rouge with Nicole Kidman?
Yes, I did.
So for me, when I think of actresses around that time frame, like the role that she played really, sizzled in my brain. And yes, she was quite lovely. And, I could see, that desire that she had to go from, the role that she was playing there to being a real actress. So, Jack, the story, The Storm, how did it come about?
Well, it is based on family stories, and that's probably how it began, is my mother and two aunts telling me the family stories about my grandmother. And they stressed that she was really very unhappy living on the farm because she wanted to be a musician. She loved music. And they also stressed the fact that my grandfather really kind of twisted her arm to get her to marry him. And she did not fit into the farm way of life at all. She had gone to the university for 3 years and wanted to be a professional pianist, or really probably a teacher and a composer more than a performer. So my grandfather promised her that he would build her a house and they would live together, but he reneged on that promise, and they lived in with his mother-in-law for, probably 10 years. And the mother-in-law was exactly opposite. She loved the farm. She was tough. She had been a Georgia belle and come over to Texas in a covered wagon, and she thought when she got here, after a few years, her husband died, so she had to raise like 7 or 8 kids. And she had like 1,000 acres and was in charge of all the farm hands and everything. So she thought, you had to work all the time. Mm-hmm. And she thought my grandmother was lazy and frivolous and so forth. So it was just a big personality conflict. And that's where my story started in forming in my head. So it's really based on, a lot of family history. But after I wrote the first draft, it was too regional. It didn't have any of what was going on in the world. So my editor at the time, or the senior editor at Bold Strokes at the time, said, you need to bring in what's happening in the world. It's World War I, women trying to get the vote, the flu epidemic, a lot of major incidents. So it developed from a simple family story with a basic romance into a more complex historical novel.
I can actually see all of those things that you mentioned from your family stories. Was it Len who told you to tie in history?
No, it was actually Jennifer Knight.
Okay.
She was our senior editor, and I learned a lot from her about both editing and writing. Mm-hmm. Of course, Lynn Barrow is wonderful. And she has helped me tremendously with several scenes. She would sit down with me and help me rewrite them, and just a little bit of help like that makes so much difference.
It was quite engaging, the storyline, and I love historical. I love historical novels. I like historical romances, and one of the main reasons is, I grew up watching the History Channel, going to museums, traveling around the world, and I love being enmeshed in that. As much as I love escapism, I do like things that are nailed down to periods in time. And God, Jack had a rough go of it in that first, I don't know if it was like a prologue, but when she shared her feelings and got shot down by Helen, and then the day ended really poorly in her own tent. But like that really grasped me. Like, have you always been, not backward looking, but have you always been fascinated with history?
Yes, I have. My mother is still alive and very much interested in history. I read a lot of the old Southern Gothic romances. I don't know if you've ever come across these. There might be before your time, but there were writers named Frank Yerby and Francis Parkinson Keyes, and there were all these steamy romances. They were probably the precursors of the Harlequin. But Frank Yerby was a black man and did a lot of research. And I think Francis Parkinson Keyes did a lot of research also. So they weren't really fluffy. I mean, they were erotic almost for the day. But I think those influenced me a lot because I would read them, my aunts would read them, and my mother would read them, and my grandmother would read them. And I felt so grown up being included in that group of women reading those historical romances that I think that's part of why I'm so interested in history and in literature and so forth. They had enough of the historical to get me into that genre, and I feel really comfortable there. My problem is that I like history maybe more than romance. Mm-hmm. I try to keep a balance, but when I'm doing research, I'll get totally strung out on the history, and I'll put too much in my manuscript sometimes, so my editor has to come through and slash through several pages and say, okay, let's get back to the romance. But like I said, the challenge, I think, of writing historical romances is to keep the balance, because the history cannot overshadow the romance. It has to be central.
And also, you want to avoid it sounding like a history book, or something that's more instructional, or what? Because it's easy to, when you've done so much research, to kind of be very married to the research and wanting all those wonderful gems that were thrilling for you to discover and to put them into the story itself. It takes discipline to kind of pull back and make sure our plot is still motoring along.
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I'm so in love with historical facts when I discover them, but after I write a scene or so and go back after a month and read it, they're not as thrilling as they were when I first discovered them. And the part that really does stand out to me then is the romance. So I think it's the feeling in the historical novel that carries it through. And that's what Lynn Burrell Radcliffe, what you want to call her, is so good at. Mm-hmm. She can create those emotions and make you feel make you read what you have felt. Mm-hmm. That's really what I strive for, but that's a real challenge, I think.
Yeah, and it's a challenge to make sure that the wonderful things that are in your mind are showing up in the page as you felt them. And a lot of times when you have, whether it's a beta reader or an editor look at it, and they're like, this is missing, or this isn't quite working, or this is not coming along quite right. And I was like, how do you not know? Don't you see all the beautiful things in my brain? So you wrote The Storm. What's well, I mean, you touched on the personal family history, but what would you give as a brief synopsis of the story for my listeners?
Okay. Well, probably the main character. I go back and forth who the main character is, but I'm going to say that it's Jack Bergeron. And she's from New Orleans. She is primarily, when the story begins, she has come from a history of being an ambulance driver during World War I and accidentally killing a man, which has haunted her quite a bit. And then she gets totally disgusted with World War I, which was kind of a travesty to a large extent. So she leaves the war and comes back home. And she becomes involved with the suffragist movement with Alice Paul, which Alice Paul was the most radical of the suffragist leaders. And so Jacqueline, she really decides she wants to fight for women's cause rather than the men's cause. It's kind of the way I put it. She has married, before she became an ambulance driver, a pilot. And it's just one of those, fall in lust and get married, and then he goes off to war. And they really have lost touch, but she's legally married. And they get back together when she goes home to New Orleans. So she wants a divorce because it's a fraudulent marriage. But he says, okay, I'll give you a divorce if you'll go to East Texas with me because my mother's just died and my dad needs some help. And I was wounded in the war and I can't drive very well and I've got a bad eye. So she said, oh, okay. So she goes to East Texas and then she could care less about that because she's a city girl. And in East Texas, she meets the other major character who is Molly Russell, and she's the one who's modeled after my grandmother. And they become involved there, and that's about as much as I can say at that point. Mm-hmm. So that's the basics of the story. Molly, like I said earlier, is like my grandmother. She's in love with music.
Mm-hmm. It must be hard to be so passionate about something that others don't value at all. Because, if I'm remembering correctly, does she lose her wedding ring when she's going to milk a cow?
Yeah, she does. And that's definitely a true story. It's the diamond out of her engagement ring. And my mother and my aunt said that it was evidently my granddad had a really good cotton crop. And he went out and bought this big 1-carat diamond engagement ring. And I think he was falling for the wrong women or whatever, but he had given it to another woman. And she decided she didn't want to marry him. So he then proposed to my grandmother, and she said, "No, I don't want to marry you." She accepted the proposal, and then she got home and she thought about it, and she thought, no. And I think probably the mother-in-law character had a lot to do with this. Mm-hmm. But she finally gave in and married him and had that engagement ring. So she was milking the cow one day and slipped, and it sprung out of the what do you call those, the prongs, and it was there in the manure and the pines, the straw and everything like that, and she couldn't find it anywhere. So my mother-in-law figured, had a fit, and thought that the chickens might have eaten it or something. It was kind of a humorous story, but it wasn't a humorous situation for my grandmother because in a way I put it in the book is that she feels freer after she's lost that diamond. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a symbolic, first step out of a marriage that she really didn't want to be in the first place. But it's, she was kind of a law-abiding person too. So it was a traumatic experience in her life. But my mother said that she remembered it, I think. She was pretty young at the time, but she remembered it, and they all got out there in the barn and looked for the diamond out of the wedding ring, but they never could find it. So
it's the diamond in the needles in the haystack, not the needle. Oh goodness, I can't imagine what that must have felt like. It would be one of those "oops, I didn't mean to do that" moments.
Right, but I'm glad I did. It happened. Yeah, that was Radcliffe said she really liked the cows, and Molly talked to the cows quite a bit. She didn't have many people to talk to on the farm, so she talks to the cow that she milks every morning. It seems to be that's her best friend before Jacqueline comes along. I had a lot of fun with, I tried to put a little comedy in it, just little touches like that. And her talking to the cow is kind of humorous. And to me, Ms. Russell, the mother-in-law, is kind of a humorous character in ways. I've had reviews of her all over the place. Some people say she's the most evil mother-in-law character they've ever read, and some of them say that she's their favorite character. So you never know what people are going to think about what you write.
What what was one of your biggest obstacles when you were writing The Storm? What was one of the biggest challenges that you had during the process?
I would say what I mentioned before, the research, getting so involved in the research, especially when I went to that second, broadening the scope of the book. When I got into that stage, I fell in love with the time period.
Yeah.
I researched Woodrow Wilson. I had chapters about him. I researched Eddie Rickenbacker. I read his autobiography. I had chapters about him. I think there's 2 sentences about him in the final book. And, all about the flu epidemic, of course, and a lot of that stayed. The suffragist movement, I had a lot of chapters about Alice Paul. Mm-hmm. And, they said, my gosh, this is tremendously too much history in this. So it was keep putting too much in and then having to rip it all out. I mean, I didn't regret it because I enjoyed the process, but I spent many hours working on that book. I think I started writing that book about probably 15 years before it was published. Mm-hmm. So it was, but like I said, it was a labor of love. You certainly don't write for money, but it was just a learning process. And as a teacher, I love to learn as well as I do to teach. So.
Do you feel differently when you're editing people's work now that you've been on the other end of the pen?
Well, yes. Yeah, I feel a lot more sympathy, definitely. But, it seems to me that the more I write, the more I realize how complex writing is. Mm-hmm. It's just amazingly difficult to write a good book, and I admire my writers so much, mm-hmm. the writers that I edit. I think I appreciate what they do a lot more now than when I started mm-hmm. trying to write, because they have a lot of skills that I would love to have. So they've become my teachers a lot more than they were before I started writing, and I view them as peers, and I think to much more of a degree they view me as a peer. Mm-hmm. I know now what it's like to write a book and to go to conferences and to sell, try to sell books, to be on panels. And before I could, I just sat in the audience and I was hidden. But now I know what it's like to be out in front of the public. And that's, to be in front of the public, yet be a writer, that's because, writing is a solitary thing to a large extent. And I just appreciate the authors, I think, a lot more now than I did. I was more like a teacher with a student mm-hmm. before I became a writer.
So I have a question for you, considering that obviously the 30s and 40s is after the time frame for The Storm, but why did you decide to have First Tango in the 70s?
My first thought that I wanted to write a series for every 10 years and use the Jacqueline and Molly to do kind of a decades type thing. Mm-hmm. But I don't know, it's hard to carry, we always say that after they say I love you, that's the end of their story. Go find 2 more characters. And to a large extent, that's kind of what happened in my mind. I told their story, and it would probably get too much into the history if I took them then into the late 20s, the late 30s, and so forth. And also, concurrently with writing The Storm, I was writing, it wasn't really autobiographical, but I did travel a lot to Europe during the 70s especially. And I did spend time in Paris in 72. And I thought that was a pivotal year in the women's movement. Mm-hmm. So that's some of the reasons that I chose 72, because we were just coming out of the 60s. The feminist movement was really gaining a lot of steam. Mm-hmm. And I found this, I created the character of Bridget. She's had several different names, but I created her as kind of a symbol for the feminism that I think was happening during that time period. And then I just, out of totally imagination, I created Eva because I wanted Bridget to fall in love with a French woman. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I didn't have any plan at all why I chose 72, but I just think it was an exciting time in our development as a nation, and especially, like I said, in the development of women coming into our own. And that's a major theme in The Storm, obviously, because my main characters are women and they are trying to get free from the establishment and so forth. And I think Bridget and Eva characters are doing the same thing, but they're in a different time period. But it's essentially getting away from the dominance of men and standing on their own 2 feet. So in a way, it's the same story, but totally different setting and totally different characters, for sure.
One of the things that I like about your books is that there are intellectual and political messages, but you have a very gentle hand with them, and even the same with history. You did a very good job of editing. That I feel that I'm in the moment, I'm in the setting, I'm experiencing the things that they do, and Eva's got her own agenda, and so does Bridget. But I like how it's almost like unfurling the petals of a rose. You find you go deeper and deeper and deeper until you get to the heart of it. And I like the way it flows. It's engaging without being sensationalistic, or not Harlequin-esque. But there are some books that kind of tug on easy heartstrings, and I felt that you walked your own path with both of the books.
Yeah, I said it's very difficult to know what your book looks like to other people, and it's very gratifying to know and interesting to know how it appears to other people. That's one of the things as a teacher. I didn't lecture very much. I always, when I taught literature classes, I would put my students in a circle, and we would discuss the literature. I was kind of like an interviewer, I suppose. I had a list of questions, and I'd bring up the questions. And then and the students would participate rather well. So, and it always fascinated me how many different points of view that the students would have. Just, things I would never have thought of in interpreting a passage of literature. They were there, and they would, debate back and forth and so forth. And my basic philosophy is no one's right. It's just, we just all come to whatever experience we have or whatever we read from a different point of view, and we see it through those eyes. And sometimes talking to someone else will make us modify our point of view a little bit. But basically, I think, we keep those same lenses all the time, throughout our life, and just add or subtract a little bit as we go. Mm-hmm. So I think that's why I like literature so much, because it's so multifaceted and such a challenge to write. I'll never get over that. But you write, don't you, Liz?
I do, and I am currently in the midst of a very challenging revision because I had started writing this book maybe 6 years ago, and I put it aside, then I picked it up for 6 or 8 months and worked on it, and then put it aside for whatever reasons, and then I decided that I was going to let it see the light, so to speak, and I was revising it this summer, and it was very laborious, and then I finally got around, and I was like, I think I have the perfect angle for this, so I did it, and I sent it to my beta, and it came back, and She did not like my main character. She thought that, it came off as superficial and all this other kind of stuff. And I was like, no, you don't understand. I love Charlie. So I had to sit down and really consider the things that she had to say. And I realized I was married to certain things as a part of the plot that were important to me 6 years ago. But like as a writer, you have to be able to release things that are not working. So I sat down, I rethought it, I came up with a new plot that I think is much better. I adjusted the characters, and so now I'm in this really intimidating phase of having many, many, many chapters to write to come up with what I call my new draft, and then I'll be sending it off to folks. It's going to be on my table, the Liz McMullen show table at GCLS for people to pick up. But it's very, it's very intimidating to have so much to do. But it's also good to have steadfast, hard deadlines that I cannot slither away from. So yeah, it's not easy.
Yeah, I know the feeling.
But I mean, I'm happy, and and as I was telling, I have, different writer friends, and as I was telling excitedly 2 weeks ago when I came up with a new plot, I was explaining it to my friends, and as I was explaining it, it kind of crystallized things for me, and so it's very exciting and dynamic and intimidating and horrifying. Ultimately, I hope somebody enjoys reading it, but yeah, it's that writing is not for the faint of heart.
Oh, it's not. And then, at first I was just devastated when I get criticism. And when I had to cut things out, it was like cutting pieces of my heart out. But it's gotten a lot easier. Oh, well, okay, I'll do it. Sometimes I still get a little bit of my feelings hurt, but you do get a little bit calloused, I suppose, or I don't know. That's not a good word. Just used to the process. Or
well, I mean, I think you have to be intellectually and emotionally in the right place to be able to deal with the process in general. I never tried writing. I think I went to a school for the gifted and talented from 5th to 8th grade, and it scarred me for life because I felt, I had so many really smart, bright, creative people around me who had natural aptitude for things like writing, and I didn't. I wrote poetry because I didn't like grammar.
Yeah.
And because I could flout, it's still a part of who I am. I could still flout convention and do what I want and write powerfully under my own terms. And I was not, as a young woman, I was not into constructive criticism. I was just not okay with it. And then by happenstance, it was actually through teaching that two things. I had a boy that I tutored for 4 years. And when we started out, he could stare at a blank page like nobody's business. And so I had to do all sorts of really creative things with him to prime the pump, so to speak, to get things working. So webbings and, lists and word associations and free writes and just a myriad of different things. I was trying to, get him to write about things that he was excited about, passionate about. And while I was doing that, and it was really hard, it wasn't like magically I found the right thing. It was water from a stone. And then I realized if I can teach him how to write and to, get it done and be creative, then maybe I can write too. And in tandem, I had discovered Radcliffe's writing, and there was something about it. I actually read 30 of her books in 30 days. I obviously had a weird sleep schedule because of it. But I was inspired to try. And then that November I wrote If I Die Before I Wake, and my best friend Jackie, she was the one I'd send the chapters to, and I'd send it to her, and she's like, and then what happens? And when it finally gets to print, she's responsible for it because she's the one who kept on encouraging me. But my writing was somewhat dismal. It was okay, but I've grown so much in the last 5 years, as we hope we all will. But it's still, it's a very challenging process to be a part of. And I read so much, obviously, for the show. And so I also have different expectations for myself. I don't know if I'm aiming too high, but considering I talk about other people's work, I have to make sure my ducks are in the order, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that it sounds like that we kind of have the same feeling about all of these good, like you were saying about the gifted and talented program. That's the way I feel editing these people now. It's like, my gosh, I can never be as good a writer as the ones that I edit, but I guess you just have to get over and say, okay, I'll just be the best writer I can be, and that's not compare yourself to them, but just be.
Well, also, because I end up reading, not so much now because I don't have the time to do it, but I've often read the body of work of some authors, and I've watched them grow so much from not just their debut novel, but maybe their first 2 or 3, and they flower into an amazing author. So I guess at this point for me, I just have to do the best that I can. I have some wonderful writers out there who are both writers and editors, and they're my stalwart beta readers, and I'm going to do my best. But it's a very challenging process. I had no idea how hard it was going to be. I mean, I never thought it was easy, but it's very challenging. But conversely, unlike the 10-year-old Liz, adult Liz knows she's got a lot to learn. I'm ready and fully prepared for constructive criticism. I think, my one friend who's debated that, I ended up revamping my entire story because of, she's like, I hope you're not pissed at me. And I said, how could I possibly ask you for your point of view and punish you for giving it to me? And you're a professor, and I've grown up with a family of teachers, and I've always been open to learning new things and trying new things and growing. So I guess I think I just needed to be old enough to be able to handle it. I don't know if my skin will ever be properly thick for reviews and edits and whatnot, but I'm definitely grown enough that I can handle it now, much more so than I could have in my adolescence.
I think it's easier to take it from people that you know and people that you know care. Mm-hmm. I don't know if anyone ever gets over the anonymous review or the review by someone that you don't know. Mm-hmm. I think that I've heard a lot of writers say, that hurt, and that's you see in the movies and so forth that a lot of actresses will not read their reviews and so forth. So I don't know what's going on there, but I'm not that far along, I guess. But I don't.
I guess I've had on a few times Alex Trist. She has a different view towards flame. Which is the vernacular for when somebody really rips you a new one. And she said, well, I take it as a compliment, because if somebody is so impassioned that they have to write a letter or review excoriating my work, that it's, then I've inspired emotion in someone. I was like, wow, you're a better woman than I am.
I do recall having one review that kind of I couldn't get past, and I had to kind of think like that to get past it. It's really scary to put yourself out there. I mean, and that's what you're doing. You're just burying yourself, walking around nude almost, emotionally. So, yeah.
And you have that feeling like me, love me. It's not like the desperate dating service, love my work, because this is a part of, my heart. And for you with The Storm, it's not just the story or the history, it's also fragments of the history of your family, and you sound like you came from some good, hearty stock, a lot of strong women.
Yeah, I did. I was really lucky. Even if they didn't like each other or get along, they were still strong in their own ways. And I saw a lot of myself in all of those characters. Mm-hmm. Jacqueline is my adventuresome self, and Molly is my pleasing everyone and loving the art self, and Ms. Russell is my get out in the yard and work myself into the ground self, and be kind of nasty if somebody else isn't working as hard as I am. So I think you really discover pieces of yourself as you write, which is part of the joy, I think, of writing.
One of the things that I wanted to say about, particularly First Tango, because I read Storm last year, is that I traveled a lot. I went to school in Ireland for a year, and it's like a puddle jump to get to Paris, and I like to go to Paris and Amsterdam. And I visited those places so often, and so many times I was just really fortunate, and I backpacked around Europe, and some of the things that you said, drew on to me, like when Eva was talking about how when she goes around, she tries to find folks who are the people who live there. And one of my survival strategies for backpacking around Europe as a single woman alone was when I would go to different places, let's say I went to a bar, I'd get to know like the bartender, the barbacks, the bouncers, the staff, and, bonds with them, because tentatively they can kind of keep an eye out for you. And I think one of the unfair advantages that us queer folk have is that there's some extra part of acceptance in the LGBT community in bars, is that we kind of look out for each other much more so than in heterosexual bars and whatnot. So I felt a little bit safer, but there's a lot of danger Bambi in the forest stuff. But getting back to your book, I could tell, with each scene, with each place that you were describing, that it was from the point of view of somebody who had seen these things. I mean, I know there are very gifted people who can do research and fictionalize all these different sensations and things that they're seeing, experiencing. But everything about what you wrote rang true, and I haven't been to Paris in at least 15 years. But I still felt like I was there again and seeing it through the eyes. Things that I was familiar about, places I've been to, like Les Marais and, Sacré-Cœur and all those kind of things. So you did really good.
Good, that's great. I have not been to Chamonix, and I did do research for that. Mm-hmm. I'm glad to know that have you been there?
I've only been to Paris. I've not been to Versailles.
No, I'm talking about the lesbian bar.
I don't know that I've been to a lot of lesbian bars in the gay part of the city.
Okay.
My friend, when I went, when I was a little bit older, I think I was 22, there was a French tutor. I was working in the City Court building. I was working for a money manager, a hedge fund manager. And there was a French tutor that a lot of the different businessmen and women would have teach them French so that they can interact with their colleagues who are French speakers. And I actually hired her because I knew I was going back to Paris and I wanted to have, a little bit more language, not fluency. It's just not going to happen for me. And I had her teach me how to ask where to find a lesbian bar. So I had to ask for une boîte pour la femme, which is the box for a woman. But apparently that was like, that was one of the things that she taught me. And there's certain parts of Paris that I remember walking through, singing cafes, and there was an art supply place. I think I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like Graphy Grow or something along those lines. And I got oil paint bars and charcoal, and I felt all artistic as I had my pads, and I'd be, in all these different beautiful, amazing places like Musée d'Orsay and on the Seine, and walking around, and I'd have my little pad, and I'd feel like a little French artist.
Yeah, this is really a special place. I've been there about 3 different times, I think, and it really affected me every time I went. It's like a different feel or different feeling. I was overwhelmed the first couple of times. It was like, now being a country girl, from East Texas, that was a major, major city.
No kidding, and such a special, magical place. I guess I have those rose-colored glasses they always sing about. So I want to return to your novel. I love the old lesbian couple that was a part of the touring group. I thought they were great.
Yeah, I thought they really turned out well. They're not a major major characters at all, but I like that scene a lot. It just felt right for some reason.
I love it, and I also love that it was happening in the 70s. When I went to Paris as often as I did was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and obviously, the March of Time and whatnot. But I was like, wow, 40 years together and being so out. Considering that only a few years after Stonewall, and still having that openness and love together. And I like Jeanne, Eva's aunt. I thought she was great and stylish. And
yeah, she's nice, isn't she? Yeah.
I could see myself in these apartments. I think one of the things that was most successful is I don't think it's just people who, like myself, who've been there, but you really have a good sense of place and time. And one of the things that I can't put my finger on it, it's not that there's not a lot of action momentum, but the way that you write is so engaging that it pulls me along. I want to see, how things develop, and I like the unfurling, the learning more about who Bridget is and who Eva is, though I'm more interested in Bridget than Eva, just because she's so complex.
Mm-hmm.
And she's in an interesting place in her life, and she has a very haunting incident in the beginning of the book. And I like her, and I like discovering how smart she is, and it's not in that officious way, and you kind of drop breadcrumbs here and there during that the tour that Eva's leading, and just as Eva's getting to know Bridget's intellect, as a reader, we're getting to know more about her as a character.
Yeah, I think Bridget's kind of a sophisticated pretty woman character. With Pretty Woman, we know the main character for a week. And Bridget is basically kind of the same background as the woman, Pretty Woman, but I wanted her to be much more complex and get to know her better. And I hope that, that we do. I enjoyed getting to know Bridget. She was a challenge to me. She was very other to me and kind of fascinating in a way. So Eva's, like you say, I think Eva's more simple and more easily understood, but Bridget is different.
You have a unique voice, but I can feel the shades of difference between The Storm and First Tango. And I think they're almost, intentionally probably, they're tied to the era and the way that the way of knowing changes, the way of people interacting. It would be different in the 70s than it would be in the 20s or the 19th century or even the 1600s. All these different time frames has a different rhythm and speed and cadence, and like how long it takes to court or meet somebody or get to know each other, or the different social constructs that frame their lives. And it's important for the books that are written, and especially for historical books, to not have modern words coming out of the lips of people from bygone eras. It's important for the way that they speak and express themselves to be a part of the time and to be dynamic. And that's hard. I love historical fiction, but I'm not sure I have it in me to really capture another decade.
I did a lot of that in The Storm with trying to have the three major characters, each of their voices have a particular rhythm. I thought that, Molly was more poetic, slow, easier. Miss Russell was kind of down to earth and almost guttural. And Jacqueline, I wanted to have short, fast sentences. I really built into my sentence structure, into my word choice in those three characters. But it's more difficult to differentiate between the voices in First Tango, because I keep thinking, well, they're speaking French, but I'm having to write it in English. So that kind of does a disconnect for me, and I'm not fluent enough in French to know how, especially how Eva would talk. Bridget is easier because, I know how Americans would speak. But I think that that's really important in what you said about trying to capture the flavor of the time. And in the romantic part, in the sexual, I got quite a bit of criticism that I didn't put much overt sex in The Storm, but it didn't seem to fit, because I'm not saying that there wasn't overt sex. I mean, that sex wasn't important, but it just seemed like a more closeted time during 1918 than in 1972, when, the sexual revolution was in full bloom. So I've got a lot more sex in First Tango than in The Storm. So I think like you said, you have to consider all the factors. And Molly and Jacqueline take quite a while to get together, and Eva and Bridget, it's speeded up. So the action has to be faster, and to set the time period, as well as the sentence structure, the word choice. But as an editor, I'm really, really aware of not letting any of my authors use words that wouldn't have been used at the time. I use the dictionary all the time. There's an etymological online dictionary. Have you found that?
No.
It will give you the history of the words. So if I come across a word or a phrase in, a book that's written set in the 17th century, I'll go back and I'll look in that etymological dictionary and see if that word was in use at the time, or had come into being at the time. And if it hadn't, it goes. Mm-hmm. So, I'm really a purist when it comes to language, and not being, if it's not appropriate, for whatever reason, it can't stay in the book.
I have to thank you for sharing these stories and your point of view, and I know that some listeners will really enjoy your accent. There's, it's so funny that there's just certain accents that just have more of a flair of elegance to it, and so I liked listening to you. I enjoy your books very much. For those of you listening, I would pick up The Storm. And when will First Tango be available?
July the 15th is the publication.
Okay. All right. It's a little down the line, folks.
Yeah.
But it's definitely worth putting on. Like, I recommend for everybody, whenever you're listening to the show, have a little pad nearby and create a little book to-do list or to read list, and create a reading list and add First Tango on it, certainly. And I've truly enjoyed your company, Shelley. Thank you for coming on the show.
And I really appreciate you asking me. It's been a lot of fun, Liz.